The humidity pressed down like a wet blanket, making the strings sticky under my fingers. July in Savannah was always brutal, but something about this evening felt heavier, more intense. River Street stretched before me, its worn cobblestones catching the last light of day. Dark patches showing where centuries of footsteps had worn the stone smooth. My old violin case lay open at my feet, a few crumpled dollar bills and loose change scattered across its faded velvet lining. 4 hours of playing, and I hadn't even made enough for dinner. Times were getting lean on River Street, too many performers competing for too few tourist dollars. Even my regular spot near the old cotton exchange wasn't pulling in what it used to. The ghost tour shuffled past, their guide's voice carrying over my half-hearted rendition of "The Devil Went Down to Georgia." I played louder, trying to drown out his practice spiel. The tourists barely glanced my way, too focused on their guide's tales of haunted warehouses and spectral musicians. 10 years ago, River Street had been different. Real musicians played here then. Jazzmen who'd been performing since before I was born, bluesmen who could make a guitar weep. Now it was all ghost tours and t-shirt shops. The sun dipped lower and the street lamps flickered to life, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, looking like gray ghosts dancing in the twilight. A container ship crawled past on the river, its horn echoing off the old warehouse walls. That's when I saw him. He stood in the shadows of Factor's Walk, an ancient violin tucked under his chin. His clothes might have been expensive once, but now they hung on his thin frame like clothes on a scarecrow. He played something I'd never heard before. Notes that seemed to catch in the humid air and hover there, making the moss dance and the shadows deepen. But it was his face that caught me. Empty. Like someone had reached in and scooped out everything that made him human, leaving just enough machinery to move the bow across the strings. A few tourists stopped to listen, their expressions changing as the strange melody washed over them. I watched a woman wipe away tears she didn't seem to know she was crying. A man with angry eyes suddenly softened, reaching for his wife's hand. The music built to a crescendo that made my chest ache, then stopped abruptly. The violinist lowered his instrument and began walking toward me, his movements stiff and mechanical. The case at my feet suddenly felt very far away. "You're in my spot," he said, his voice as empty as his eyes. No accent, no emotion, no life. Just words falling into the heavy air like dead things. I started to apologize, to gather my things, but he held up one pale hand. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said. "I'm done. The violin wants you now." He held out the instrument, its dark wood gleaming in the streetlight. Something about it seemed to pull at me like a half-remembered song you can't quite name. I started, but he was already pressing it into my hands. "It will give you everything," he said, those dead eyes finally meeting mine, "until there's nothing left to give." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness of Factor's Walk. The violin felt warm in my hands, like something alive. A drop of rain hit the cobblestones, then another. The tourists scattered, seeking shelter in nearby bars and shops. But I stood there, holding the strange instrument, as the rain began to fall in earnest. I didn't know it then, but that was the last normal moment of my life. The last time I would feel everything, wholly and completely, without understanding what a gift that was. The rain fell harder, and somewhere in the distance I heard what sounded like laughter. Or maybe it was crying. On River Street, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. I took the violin home that night, a cramped studio apartment above a souvenir shop 3 blocks from River Street. The window unit hummed and dripped, fighting a losing battle against the Georgia heat. My neighbor's TV bled through the thin walls, the muffled sound of late-night infomercials providing a soundtrack to my restlessness. The violin lay on my kitchen table, looking oddly at home among the coffee-stained bills and past-due notices. In the harsh light of my single overhead bulb, its wood seemed darker, richer than any instrument I'd ever owned. No maker's mark, no identifying features, just smooth, age-darkened wood that seemed to drink in the light. I should have been more suspicious, should have wondered why a stranger would give away something so obviously valuable. But musicians on River Street were like that sometimes, passing instruments down, trading gear disappearing without warning. I'd seen talented performers vanish before, leaving only stories and empty spots on the cobblestones. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty face, heard that strange music. The violin seemed to watch me from the table, its presence filling my tiny apartment like smoke. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep, picked up the violin, just meaning to test it. The first note shocked me, pure and perfect, cutting through the humid night air like a knife through silk. The strings responded to the lightest touch, as if they'd been waiting for me. I played scales at first, simple exercises my first teacher had drilled into me years ago. But the violin wanted more. The music shifted, changed, became something I'd never heard before. Notes that made the air thick, that painted pictures in the darkness. A cat wailed outside. Someone down the street started crying. The TV next door fell silent. I played until my fingers bled, until the sun started to peek through my grimy window. Only then did I notice the tears on my cheeks, the way my hands shook. The music had pulled something from me. Some deep well of feeling I hadn't known I possessed, but it had given something too. When I finally slept, I dreamt of that empty-faced man. In my dream, he was young, vital, playing on a river street that looked both familiar and strange. People gathered around him, drawn by music that could heal their hurts, ease their burdens. With each song, he glowed a little less brightly. With each healing, a little more of him faded away. I woke to someone pounding on my door. "Hey," my neighbor's voice, thick with emotion. "Hey, violin guy." I opened the door to find Mike from next door, still in his grease-stained mechanic's uniform. His eyes were red, but clear. "That music last night," he said. "I've been so angry since Sarah left. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. But when you started playing..." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "First good night's sleep I've had in months. Whatever that was. Thank you." He turned and hurried away before I could respond. I watched him go, noticed how his shoulders seemed lighter, his step more confident. Inside, the violin waited on my kitchen table. In the morning light, it looked almost ordinary, almost innocent. But something felt different, the constant knot of anxiety in my chest. The one I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. Had loosened. Not gone, but transferred. Like the violin had taken it from me, used it to fuel whatever magic had helped Mike. I should have been worried, should have questioned what was happening. But all I could think about was playing again, about helping more people, about how good it felt to finally make a real difference. The violin seemed to hum in agreement. I didn't notice then that my coffee tasted flat, that the morning sun didn't warm me quite the way it used to. Didn't realize that while Mike's burden had lifted, something of mine had gone missing too. That's how it starts, I guess, not with a bang but with a song. With the slow, sweet surrender of self, traded note by note for the power to heal others' pain. The next night would be my first back on River Street with the violin. The night I'd begin to understand what the empty-faced man had meant about giving everything. But that's getting ahead of the story. My first night back on River Street started like any other. I set up in my usual spot, the worn cobblestones still damp from an afternoon shower. The old violin's case, I'd kept it, leaving my battered one behind, sat open at my feet, its dark velvet lining cleaner, deeper than my old one. The evening crowd was starting to filter in, that mix of sunburned tourists and locals that defined River Street after dark. A group of college girls in bright sundresses giggled past, their shoes clicking on the uneven stones. 2 old men sat on a nearby bench, sharing a brown-bagged bottle and decades of friendship. I started with something simple, a Shokan farewell, a piece I'd played 1,000 times before. But it came out different now, fuller, richer. The notes seemed to catch the last rays of sunlight, turning them into something you could almost see. The college girls stopped giggling, the old men lowered their bottle. A child pulling his mother toward River Street Sweets froze mid-whine, transfixed. The music moved through the crowd like wind through Spanish moss, touching each person differently. I watched a businessman loosen his tie, tears streaming down his face as some burden I couldn't see lifted from his shoulders. A young woman with tired eyes and a waitress uniform stopped, her exhaustion melting away like morning fog on the river. Tips began to fill the case, not just 1s and 5s, but 20s, 50s. I barely noticed. The violin was singing now, playing itself as much as being played. Each note pulled something from me. Memories, feelings, pieces of my soul, and transformed them into healing for others. A ghost tour paused nearby, the guide falling silent mid-story as the music washed over his group. Even the Spanish moss seemed to dance differently, swaying to rhythms that hadn't existed before tonight. I don't know how long I played. Time felt different, stretched and compressed like taffy in the humid air. But eventually, I noticed my hands were shaking, my legs unsteady. The violin's neck felt slick with sweat or blood. I couldn't tell which. When I finally lowered the bow, the street was quiet except for the sound of the river. The crowd slowly dispersed, moving like people waking from a deep sleep. Many wiped their eyes, looking confused at their damp cheeks. Others just walked away, their steps lighter, their shoulders straighter. An old woman was the last to leave. She stood before me, clutching a worn handbag, her eyes clear and knowing. "Been coming to River Street every night for 30 years, she said, her voice soft but steady. "Not since Marie Laveau herself have I felt such power." She reached into her bag, pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "But power always costs, child. Always." She tucked the bill into my case and walked away, her shoes making no sound on the cobblestones. I counted the money with trembling hands, more than I'd ever made in a month of playing. But something felt off. The bills seemed less green somehow. The texture felt wrong under my fingers. Even the streetlights looked different, their warm glow reduced to mere illumination without comfort. That's when I saw him again, the empty-faced man. He stood in the shadows of Factor's Walk, watching. When our eyes met, he nodded once, a gesture of recognition, of understanding, of warning. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with a case full of money I could barely feel, and a violin that hummed with satisfaction. I packed up quickly, suddenly desperate to be home. But as I walked, I realized I couldn't remember what I'd had for breakfast. Couldn't recall my mother's voice, though I'd spoken to her just yesterday. The memory was there, but the feeling that should have accompanied it, the warmth, the comfort, the mild annoyance at her worrying, was just gone. The violin's case felt heavy in my hand, full of more than just money, full of pieces of myself I hadn't meant to give away. But even that realization felt distant, academic, like reading about someone else's loss in yesterday's newspaper. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, each step heavier than the last. The window unit was still fighting its losing battle with the heat, but I barely noticed the temperature. My neighbor's TV was still playing through the thin walls, but the sound meant nothing. The violin waited patiently in its case, ready for tomorrow night, ready to take more, ready to help me help others, one piece of my soul at a time. I should have been terrified, should have locked it away, thrown it in the river, run as far as I could. Instead, I set my alarm for tomorrow evening. After all, there were so many people who needed help, so many burdens I could lift, so many pieces of myself I could still give away.